I say vote yes, vote yes, vote for independence. Say, someone to open up a window.
Peter, these are really the Peter Stone days on Broadway. I mean, you have as many shows as Andrew Lloyd Webber with 1776 and Titanic. I know you had a lot of success in the past, but I mean, do you feel that you are now in your halcyon days as a Broadway writer? And
or as I heard someone say the other day on television, my Helicon days. Well, it's a good time. I mean, these are both shows. It was my first Tony and my last Tony, and
you won the Tony for book for Titanic, and
yeah. And on 1776, both shows won Best Show.
Mm-hmm.
Both, you know, they're both quite. They have similarities. They're both historically based, dealing with fact in the musical. In a musical style, a musical genre, but it's the first show I've done since, well, Will Rogers had a bit of it. The Life of Will Rogers, that dealt a good deal with fact as well, but not to the extent. That one was tricked up to be a Ziegfeld show. It was his life as Ziegfeld would have done it.
Right.
You know, this is the Titanic as it happened, and the signing of the Declaration as it happened. The facts of 1776 are very, very strongly based in this show. There's very little
poetic
straying.
license. Or?
Yeah, there's a good deal of poetic license, but not with the facts.
We should say, for those who haven't seen it, the protagonist of 1776 is John Adams.
And Franklin and Jefferson.
But everybody dislikes John Adams, which apparently was true.
Well, dislikes him personally. The expression at the time that he was obnoxious and disliked, but they respected him. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, or not, depending, you'll be the judge of that, Richard Nixon admired John Adams more than anybody else, because after the war was won, or during the period when the war was going on, there was the thing called the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers fired into a crowd of Americans. They killed 5. It was still called a massacre. Kent State was 4. They didn't call it a massacre because we'd run out of. By then, hyperbole was changed. The soldiers were arrested and tried, and they were terrible. They were almost lynched. Mm-hmm. And John Adams went in and defended them under the principle that everybody is entitled to a spirited defense. And even Richard Nixon. So I think that's why he admired him more than anybody else.
Also, though, I think Adams, at least in your interpretation of him, is extremely bright, but also dark and brooding and prickly. A little bit, I think, quite a bit like Nixon was.
Well, there are great differences.
Yeah.
Adams was a scrupulously legitimate man. I mean, he was scrupulously
didn't have a tape recorder around either.
Honest is the word I don't like to use, but he certainly was. His integrity was beyond question, and but Adams was a driving force. His energy was a driving force. Certainly Franklin's authority, because he was the oldest man but one in the Congress. He was an accomplished man. And he was a venerable character, and he had a great deal of influence.
And popular author, Benjamin Franklin.
Yes. And a printer, and many other. It's remarkable is that all these men had many professions. And there was the young Jefferson, still untried, who, as Adams himself says, they made him write it because he wrote 10 times better than any man in Congress, including Adams, as Adams said.
Right.
He had a happy talent for composition, and he was a very graceful man with a pen. But he's also an architect. He was also a great.
A bon vivant with the slaves.
Well, that was later in his life.
Not in there, right?
Not at this point.
No.
But it is a show also about the molding of a writer, about Jefferson emerging as this articulate
as a kind of writer, yes. And but it's really about the problems of getting the country started, which somehow those problems they're not taught. It was a great puzzlement to me for a long time why they're not taught, why they weren't taught. I was a pretty good history student all through high school and college. I didn't know a lot about it, and it's our national myth. I mean, it's our national legend. I didn't know a great deal about it. I knew that they had cardboardized all of these characters.
Yes.
and they weren't human.
No.
They were mythic, and that part. But I also knew about 5 names who had signed. I knew Hancock because it was that large signature, right? And I knew Button Gwinnett somehow because it was the rarest one at the autograph houses because he'd only signed one other thing in his life. But I didn't know who anybody else was. I didn't know what was going on at the time. I didn't realize that the country was, in a sense, divided in 3 separate and different sections. That the colonies, the 4 New England colonies were very, very political and very even radical. The 4 Middle Atlantic colonies were very, very conservative and business-like. They handled the mercantile and,
right. You certainly showed that the forces of conservatism have not changed.
No. Well, there's an interesting story about that. But also the 4 southern colonies were agrarian and slaveholders.
Yeah.
It was their peculiar institution, as they called it. Only Virginia stood apart as the nobility of the colonies. And whenever you wanted to do anything that would get the other colonies to agree, you always got a Virginian to do it. To lead the army, you got Washington. To propose independence, you got Richard Henry Lee. To write the Declaration, you got Jefferson, and so forth. And
because they were the only ones people would go along with.
They had a kind of standing, a kind of respect. The whole colony was or aristocracy of the colonies and of the other colonies. And but if you want to accomplish something, Patrick Henry, and so forth, you got one of them. But you mentioned the Eastern, the Atlantic, Middle Atlantic colonies. 1776 played the Nixon White House back in 1970, I think. And later, when Jack Warner, who was the head of the Warner Brothers, made the film, it wasn't made. He didn't make it at Warner Brothers, but he had left Warner Brothers, but he was one of the original founding members, and he produced this film. He never produced anything else in his life as a hands-on producer. He'd just been a studio head. Nixon called him. Now, Nixon and he had a relationship dating back to the beginning of the blacklist, when all the studio heads all caved in because they didn't want trouble. And they had a bit of a relationship, and Nixon told him to cut out the conservative number. The men
to the right, always to the right, never to the left.
It was a minuet danced by the...
Very powerful number.
Very powerful number. Nixon asked him to cut it out, and he did cut it out, and to make certain it was out, he burnt the negative. And the film was released without it, to its detriment. However, later, when they went to do the Laserdisc, the people who did the disc went on searching for it and found a positive, not a negative, in the film vaults, in the salt caverns of Utah or Colorado, wherever they're kept, and actually found a positive of it and inserted it in the, and now it's back in the video cassette.
Well, now let's take a look at them doing this. It's the cool, considerate men at the roundabout.
Yes.
Come ye cool, considerate set. We'll dance together to the same minuet. To the right, ever to the right, never to the left, forever to the right. Let our creed be never to exceed regulated speed, no matter what the need. Come sing Hosanna, Hosanna.